The most dangerous sound on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942 was silence. Imagine you were a German soldier. You are dug into a frozen trench outside of Stalingrad. The temperature is 30 degrees below zero. The wind cuts through your greatcoat like a razor blade. You are exhausted. You have not slept in 3 days because every time you close your eyes, the sirens go off. You are waiting for the roar of engines. You are waiting for the heavy thrum of a Soviet bomber formation. But you do not hear engines. You do not hear anything but the wind howling over the steppe and the snap of your own cigarette burning down. Then you hear it. A soft, rhythmic whoosh. It sounds like a broom sweeping across a wooden floor. It sounds like fabric tearing in the wind. It is a whisper from the sky, directly above your head. You look up, but you see nothing. The night is pitch black. There are no exhaust flames, no silhouette, just that terrifying, gentle rustle. 2 seconds later, the world explodes. A 50-kilogram bomb lands directly in your fuel depot. The blast wave knocks you into the mud. The fuel drums ignite, turning the freezing night into a blinding orange day. As you scramble for your rifle, screaming for the anti-aircraft gunners to wake up, you hear another sound. A small, chip-sputtering engine coughs to life overhead. It sounds like a lawnmower. And then, fading away into the darkness, you hear something that freezes the blood in your veins even faster than the Russian winter. You hear laughter. High-pitched, feminine laughter. You have just been visited by the Nachthexen, the night witches. To the German High Command, these pilots were a biological anomaly. They could not explain how a primitive aircraft could penetrate the sophisticated air defense network of the Third Reich night after night. The rumors in the German mess halls were wild. The soldiers whispered that the Soviet Union had created a squad of genetically modified women. They claimed these pilots were given special injections that dilated their pupils, giving them perfect night vision, like cats. They said they were criminals. They forced to fly suicide missions. The fear was so intense that the Luftwaffe issued an automatic standing order. Any German pilot who shot down one of these witches was immediately awarded the Iron Cross. It was the only time in the war that a medal was guaranteed for shooting down a biplane. Why? Because it was humiliating. The mighty Aryan war machine, equipped with Messerschmitt fighters and radar-guided Flak, was being dismantled, piece by teenage girls flying airplanes made of plywood and bed sheets. But there were no special injections. There was no genetic modification. There was just a plane that was too slow to die, and a group of women who were too angry to quit. To understand the absurdity of this mismatch, you have to look at the machine, the Polikarpov Po-2. If you looked up obsolete in a dictionary in 1941, you would find a picture of the Po-2. It was designed in the 1920s as a crop duster and a training plane. It was made of wood and fabric. It had an open cockpit. It was powered by a 5-cylinder engine that produced 100 horsepower, less than a modern Honda Civic. Its top speed was roughly 90 miles per hour. That is not a typo. A German Messerschmitt could fly 3 times faster without even using its throttle. The Po-2 was so slow that it defied the laws of aerial combat. The stall speed of a German fighter, the speed at which it falls out of the sky, was higher than the top speed of the Po-2. This meant that if a German ace tried to get behind a night witch to shoot her down, he would stall his own plane and crash before he could line up the sights. It was like trying to attack a bicycle with a Formula One car. But in 1941, this crop duster was the only thing standing between Moscow and total destruction. The story begins with a woman named Marina Raskova. In the Soviet Union, Raskova was a rock star. She was the Soviet Amelia Earhart. She was a record-breaking navigator, a hero of the people, and a personal favorite of Joseph Stalin. She received thousands of letters from women across Russia who wanted to fight. They were mechanics, students, factory workers. They saw their brothers and fathers dying on the front lines, and they were tired of rolling bandages. They wanted to pull triggers. When the Germans invaded in June 1941, the situation was catastrophic. The Red Air Force was wiped out on the ground in the first week. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. The panzer divisions were rolling toward Moscow. Raskova used her fame to cash in a favor. She marched into the Kremlin and demanded that Stalin authorize the formation of female aviation regiments. The military brass hated the idea. They were traditionalists. They believed war was a man's job. They thought women would panic under fire, that they could not handle the heavy controls, that they would be a liability. Raskova did not care. She had the letters T, and she had Stalin's ear. In October 1941, Order 0099 was signed. The 122nd Aviation Group was born. Raskova put out a call for volunteers. Thousands of women applied. She selected the best 400. Most of them were students. Some were as young as 17. They were pulled from university classrooms in Moscow and put on trains to Ingles, a dusty town on the Volga River. They arrived expecting to be treated like soldiers. Instead, they were treated like a joke. The male instructors looked at them with open disdain. They gave them uniforms designed for men. Imagine a 19-year-old girl who weighs 100 pounds trying to walk in size 42 combat boots. They had to tear up their bedding to make foot wraps just to keep the boots from falling off. Their greatcoats dragged in the mud. They looked like children playing dress-up. But the training was not a game. It was brutal. Raskova knew that these women could not just be good enough. They had to be perfect. If they failed, it would not just be a personal failure. It would be used as proof that women could not fight. She condensed a 3-year flight school program into 6 months. They flew 14 hours a day. They studied navigation at night until their eyes bled. They slept in unheated barracks where the water in the wash basins froze solid. And then came the equipment. The men got the new fighters, the Yaks and the Mi-Gs. The women got the leftovers. When the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was formed, they were led to a grassy field and shown their bombers. The pilots stared at the Po-2s in disbelief. These were the planes they had learned to fly on. These were the kukuruzniks, the crop dusters. They were fragile. A single bullet could shatter the wing spar. A tracer round would set the fabric skin on fire instantly. They had no armor plating, no bulletproof glass, no radio. The navigation system consisted of a map, a stopwatch, and a flashlight. But the biggest insult was the parachute. In the beginning, the commanders decided that parachutes were too heavy. The Po-2 could barely carry the weight of 2 women and 200 kilograms of bombs. Every pound mattered, so they left the parachutes on the ground. If the plane caught fire, you did not jump. You burned. The men at the airfield laughed. They called it the Dolls Regiment. They made bets on how long it would take for them to quit. They asked if the planes were equipped with mirrors for applying lipstick. The commander of the regiment, Evdokia Bershenskaya, did not laugh. She was a stern, iron-willed pilot who ran the regiment with stricter discipline than any male unit. She told her pilots to ignore the mockery. She told them that the Po-2 had advantages that the men were too arrogant to see. It could take off from a mud puddle. It was easy to repair. And it was quiet. The strategy was born out of necessity. They could not fly during the day. The German fighters would slaughter them. They had to fly at night. But flying a primitive biplane at night without radar or instruments is suicidal. You have to navigate by the stars and the shapes of the forests below. You have to feel the wind. The first mission took place in June 1942. The target was a German headquarters near the front lines. 3 planes took off into the black sky. The pilots, Nadia Popova and Katya Ryabova, sat in the open cockpits. The wind whipped their faces. They climbed slowly, the little engines straining. They reached the target area. Below them, They saw the flicker of German campfires.
They saw the trucks parked in rows.
This is where they invented the tactic that would earn them their name. If they flew over the target with the engines roaring, the Germans would hear them coming and douse the lights. They would start firing the flak guns. So, 5 miles out, Popova pulled the throttle back. Ideally, the engine would go to idle. But in the Po-2, the engine was so simple it would often sputter and die if you idled it too long. So they did not just idle. They turned the engine off. The propeller stopped spinning. The roar vanished. The biplane became a glider. Popova pushed the nose down. The plane drifted silently through the darkness. The only sound was the wind rushing over the bracing wires, that distinct whoosh. The Germans on the ground were listening for engines. They were not listening for the wind. Popova watched the ground rush up to meet her. 2,000 feet. 1,000 feet. She pulled the release lever. The bombs fell away. Boom! The explosions shattered the night. The German camp erupted in chaos. Soldiers ran out of their tents in their underwear, firing blindly into the sky. Searchlights swept the clouds. But Popova was already gone. She had restarted the engine, a terrifying process that required diving steep to get the prop to windmill, and was clawing her way back to the safety of the dark. When they landed back at the base, the ground crews, also women, ran out to meet them. They armed the planes again. They refueled them by hand, and 20 minutes later, Popova took off again. And again. And again. The men of the Red Air Force were stunned. A typical male bomber crew might fly 1, maybe 2 missions a night. It was exhausting work. The women of the 588th were flying 7, 10, sometimes 18 missions in a single night. They were turning the war into a factory shift. They did not sleep. They drank water from rusty buckets and ate chunks of black bread in the cockpit, while the mechanics hung fresh bombs on the wings. The Germans quickly realized that this was not a normal enemy. The sheer volume of attacks was breaking their morale. You can fight a soldier who attacks you, but you can't fight a ghost who denies you sleep for weeks on end. The legend of the Nachthexen began to spread through the trenches. The German command brought in their best night fighter pilots. They brought in radar-guided searchlights. They dedicated entire flak batteries to hunting these crop dusters. One German ace, Josef Kochiak, managed to shoot down 4 of them in a single night. He expected to find monstrous, chemically enhanced mutants in the wreckage. Instead, he found young women with photos of their families in their pockets. It did not make sense to the Nazi ideology. How could subhumans flying furniture defeat the master race? But the 588th was just getting started. They had proven they could bomb. Now they had to prove they could survive. The winter of 1942 was coming, and the Po-2, with its open cockpit, was about to become a freezer. The pilots faced a new enemy, frostbite. And unlike the Germans, the cold did not miss. As the regiment moved deeper into the war, the laughter from the male pilots stopped. They stopped calling them the Dolls Regiment. They started calling them Little Sisters. But the women did not want to be sisters. They wanted to be killers. And over the burning ruins of Stalingrad, that is exactly what they became. To truly understand the nightmare of the 588th Regiment, you have to get out of the cockpit for a moment and look at the ground. A fighter pilot, like the Red Barons of the world, lands, drinks some schnapps, sleeps in a bed, and flies maybe 2 missions a day. The Night Witches were fighting a different kind of war. They were fighting a factory war. The rhythm of the night was relentless. A pilot would land her Po-2 on a pitch-black runway, guided only by 3 kerosene lanterns placed in the dirt. Before the propeller even stopped spinning, the ground crew would swarm the plane. These were not burly men with forklifts. These were 18-year-old girls, former literature students and textile workers, wearing oversized men's coats. They had 5 minutes. 5 minutes to refuel the plane and reload the bomb racks. The Po-2 carried rudimentary bombs, usually Fab 50s or Fab 100s. These weighed between 100 and 200 pounds. There were no hydraulic lifts. There were no cranes. The mechanics had to lift these iron death cylinders with their bare hands, balance them on their knees, and heave them up to the racks under the wings. In the summer, it was back-breaking work in the mud, but in the winter of 1942, it became torture. The metal of the bombs was so cold that if you touched it with your bare skin, your flesh would bond to it instantly. When you pulled away, the skin ripped off. The mechanics' hands were constantly bleeding, cracked, and wrapped in dirty rags. They worked in silence, in the dark, terrified that a German night fighter might spot a spark and strafe the field. Once the bombs were racked, the pilot, who had not left the cockpit, would gun the engine. The mechanic would grab the wingtip to help turn the plane around, getting blasted by the freezing prop wash. The plane would disappear into the night, and the mechanics would sit in the snow, counting the minutes, listening for the return engine. If the sound did not come back, they knew their friend was gone. Then, another plane would land, and they would lift another 200-pound bomb. Some crews flew 15 sorties in a single night. Imagine the physical exhaustion. The pilots were hallucinating from lack of sleep. They had to keep the cockpit open because if they closed it, on the rare modified planes that had enclosures, they would fall asleep and crash. The freezing wind was the only thing keeping them awake. And the navigation? It was primitive. They did not have radar. They did not have radio beacons. They navigated by dead reckoning. They used a stopwatch and a map. They looked for landmarks, a bend in the river, a burning village, a forest edge. If the wind changed speed and they did not calculate it, they would drift miles off course. If they drifted too far, they ran out of fuel. If they ran out of fuel over German lines, they were dead. But the Germans were not just sitting there letting themselves be bombed. They adapted. They realized that the sewing machines, as they called the Po-2s, were slow and fragile. They could not chase them easily with fast fighters because of the stall speed issue, so they decided to build a trap. They created flak circuses. The Germans would ring a target with dozens of searchlights, not the small handheld ones, but massive industrial carbon arc lights that could pierce the clouds. They would wait for the sound of the Po-2. When the pilot was directly overhead, they would flip the switch. Suddenly, the pilot was blinded. The searchlights would cross in the sky, trapping the tiny biplane in a cone of blinding white light. It was like being an insect under a magnifying glass. The pilot could not see the ground. She could not see her instruments. She was totally exposed. Then, the flak would start. 37mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns would pour fire into the intersection of the lights. To escape the circus, the Night Witches had to do the impossible. They had to sideslip. A sideslip is a maneuver where you bank the wings but apply opposite rudder. The plane flies sideways, dropping altitude rapidly like a stone. It's a violent, stomach-turning maneuver. Nadia Popova, one of the most famous pilots of the regiment, described being caught in a circus. "It was like the sun had exploded in my face," she said. "I could feel the heat of the shells passing my head." She kicked the rudder, throwing her plane into a chaotic spiral. The fabric of her wings was shredded by shrapnel. She could hear the canvas tearing, but she did not pull up. She dove until she was skimming the treetops, using the darkness of the forest to hide from the lights. She made it back to base, with 42 holes in her plane. Her mechanic patched them with scraps of uniform and glue. Popova drank a cup of tea, smoked a cigarette, and took off again 20 minutes later. But not everyone was lucky. The tragedy of the Po-2 was its construction. It was made of wood and fabric, doped with a flammable lacquer. It was essentially a flying matchstick. If a German incendiary bullet hit the fuel tank, or even the wing, the plane did not just smoke. It vanished in a fireball. And remember, for the first year of the war, they had no parachutes. The commanders had reasoned that the parachutes added too much weight, and, in a darker twist of logic, they thought the lack of parachutes would force the pilots to fight harder to save the plane. It was a cruel calculation. The pilots carried pistols, not to shoot at the Germans, but for themselves. They had a pact. If the plane caught fire, or if they crashed behind enemy lines, they would save the last bullet. They knew what the Nazis did to captured women. The propaganda stories were horrific, but the reality was worse. Being taken prisoner was not an option. There is a story of a pilot named Lyuba. Her plane was hit by flak over the Caucasus. The wing caught fire. The fire spread to the cockpit. Her wingman, flying 50 yards away, watched helplessly. She saw Lyuba stand up in the cockpit, engulfed in flames, trying to steer the plane away from a village. There was no radio to say goodbye, just a burning torch falling from the sky. The regiment watched their sisters burn night after night. They gathered the ashes in the morning. They cried. And then, when the sun went down, they climbed back into the same wooden coffins and flew back to the same target. Why? What drives a person to do that? It was not just patriotism. It was rage. Almost every woman in the 588th had lost someone. A father, a husband, a brother, a child. The Germans had rolled across Russia, burning villages and executing civilians. The women were not fighting for a map. They were fighting for revenge. They painted slogans on the sides of their planes. For motherland, for Stalin, for Tanya. This rage made them reckless. It made them creative. As the German defenses got thicker, the witches developed a new tactic, the pairs attack. They would fly in groups of two. The first plane would fly in loud. She would rev her engine, flash her navigation lights, and essentially scream, "Here I am! Shoot me!" The German searchlights would snap on. The flak guns would swing toward the noise. The first pilot would immediately go into a wild, evasive dance, drawing the fire, acting as the bait. While every German gunner was distracted by the first plane, the second pilot would come in from the opposite side. Engine off, gliding, silent. She would drop her bombs directly onto the flak battery or the searchlight generator. Boom! The lights would go out. The guns would stop. Then, both planes would restart their engines and disappear into the dark. It was a game of chicken, played with live ammunition. The bait pilot was risking her life to buy her sister 30 seconds of silence. By 1943, the regiment was legendary. They were awarded the title of Guards Regiment, the highest honor in the Soviet military. They became the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. They finally got parachutes, though many complained they were uncomfortable. They got new engines, slightly less terrible ones. But the war was shifting. The Germans were retreating. The front line was moving west. And as the Night Witches followed the front, the targets changed. They were not bombing trenches anymore. They were bombing infrastructure. Bridges, trains, airfields. This brought them into conflict with the Luftwaffe's night fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf-110. The Bf-110 was a heavy fighter equipped with radar. It was designed to hunt British heavy bombers. Against a Po-2, it was a shark hunting a minnow. The German pilot could not slow down enough to dogfight, so he would use his 20mm cannons to snipe from a distance. One night, 4 Night Witches were shot down in a row by a single German ace. He simply lined them up and picked them off like ducks in a gallery. It was a massacre. The regiment was devastated. They realized that their greatest asset, invisibility, was being eroded by technology. But they did not stop. They adapted again. They started flying even lower. Hedge hopping is a term used by pilots, but the witches took it literally. They flew at 10 feet, 5 feet. They flew so low that their wheels brushed the tips of the wheat fields. They flew between the trees in the forests. At that altitude, German radar was useless. It could not distinguish the plane from the ground clutter. The German fighters could not dive that low without crashing. The Night Witches returned to the shadows. They began to carry a special payload for the German troops: rail spikes. Bombing a train is hard. You have to hit the engine. But stopping a train is easy. The witches would fly along the railroad tracks miles behind the front lines. They would drop boxes of sharp, twisted steel spikes. These spikes would land on the tracks. When a German supply train came barreling down the line, the tires would not pop, it's a train, but the spikes would get caught in the wheels, jamming the mechanism or derailing the engine. It was low-tech sabotage. It drove the German logistics officers insane. They had to walk the tracks every morning, clearing the spikes, slowing down the entire supply chain. By 1944, the Night Witches had flown over Poland and were crossing into Germany. The landscape changed. They were no longer flying over friendly Russian forests. They were flying over hostile territory. Every farmhouse was a potential anti-aircraft post. But something else changed too. They started to meet American pilots. The U.S. Army Air Forces were conducting shuttle bombing missions, landing at Soviet bases to refuel. When the American pilots, flying their massive, shiny B-17s and Mustangs, landed and saw the Po-2s, they laughed. They asked where the real planes were. Then they saw the pilots. They saw the women climbing out of the cockpits, wiping oil from their faces, smoking rough tobacco. The Americans were stunned. In the US, women were ferrying planes. Yes, the Wasps, but they were not allowed to fly combat. The idea of a woman dropping bombs was alien to them. One American pilot asked a Night Witch, "Do not you get scared?" She looked at him, gestured to her plywood plane, and then to his aluminum fortress, and said, "I do not have time to be scared. I have a schedule." That interaction sums up the ethos of the 588th. They were not trying to make a political statement. They were not trying to prove they were men. They were simply doing a job that no one else wanted to do, in a machine that no one else wanted to fly. But the hardest part of the war was yet to come. As they approached Berlin, the skies became a solid wall of steel. The Germans were desperate. They were throwing everything they had into the air defense. The Night Witches were about to fly into the heart of the beast, and the injections of courage were about to be tested to the limit. In late 1943, the war had moved to the Crimea. The Kerch Peninsula was a slaughterhouse. Soviet Marines had launched a desperate amphibious landing at Eltigen. It was a suicide mission designed to open the door to Crimea. They secured a tiny patch of land, a beachhead, barely a few miles wide. Then, the trap snapped shut. The Germans surrounded them. They cut off the sea supply lines with E-boats and mines. They covered the sky with flak. The Marines were trapped, with their back to the sea and German tanks in front. Within days, the food ran out. Then the ammunition. Then the water. The soldiers were reduced to eating boiled leather belts and drinking seawater. They were dying not from bullets, but from hunger. The Soviet Air Force tried to send in big transport planes, Le-2s, the Russian copy of the DC-3. But the German anti-aircraft fire was too thick. The transports were big, slow targets, and they were blown out of the sky before they could even open the cargo doors. The High Command looked at the map and realized the Marines were doomed. Then, someone remembered the Little Sisters. The 46th Guards Regiment was stationed nearby. They were called into the briefing room and given a new mission. "Take the bombs off," the commander ordered. "Put the food on." This sounds like a humanitarian mission. It was not. It was the most dangerous flying of the entire war. To drop supplies to a pocket of troops the size of a football field, at night, while under fire, required a level of precision that was mathematically impossible. The mechanics, those teenage girls with the bleeding hands, rigged the Po-2s. They lashed sacks of dried bread, ammunition crates, and medical supplies to the bomb racks. They filled the rear cockpit, where the navigator sat, with loose items. The navigator's job transformed. She was not just reading a map anymore. She was a human conveyor belt. During the flight, she had to unbuckle her harness, stand up in the freezing slipstream, lean over the side of the fuselage, and physically hold heavy sacks of supplies, waiting for the pilot to shout, "Drop!" The flight path to Eltigen lay across the Kerch Strait. The Germans knew this. They set up a Flak corridor. They lined the coast with hundreds of searchlights and 20mm cannons. Nadia Popova, who would later become a hero of the Soviet Union, described the corridor as flying into the mouth of a dragon. The searchlights were so bright that you could read a newspaper in the cockpit at 2,000 feet. The moment a Po-2 entered the beam, it was blinded. But the witches did not turn back. They flew through the lights. They developed a suicidal technique. The pilot would dive the plane toward the water, gaining speed. The Po-2 would rattle and shake, threatening to break apart. They would level out at 10 feet above the waves, literally skimming the whitecaps, to stay under the radar and under the depression angle of the German guns. When they reached the beachhead, they had to pop up. They had to climb to 50 feet to find the Russian trenches. Imagine the scene on the ground. The starving Marines are huddled in the mud. The Germans are shelling them. Suddenly, they hear the familiar put, put, put of the lawnmower engine. A shadow passes overhead. The sisters are here. The navigator would lean out. She did not use a bomb sight. She used her eyes. She had to account for the wind, the speed, and the darkness. She would throw the sack of bread. It would tumble through the air and land with a thud in the mud, often just yards away from the soldiers. If she missed by 50 feet, the food went to the Germans. The pilots were flying 10, 12, sometimes 15 missions a night. They would land, reload, and go back. They were so exhausted that ground crews had to physically lift them out of the cockpits and carry them to the briefing tent for tea, then carry them back. Some pilots fell asleep while taxiing. One night, a pilot named Ryabova flew 18 sorties. 18 times she crossed the Flak corridor. 18 times she risked burning to death. By dawn, she was practically catatonic. She had delivered tons of supplies, one 200-pound sack at a time. The Marines at Eltigen survived. They held the beachhead. They eventually broke out, and they credited their lives not to the generals, but to the heavenly creatures who threw bread from the clouds. But the stress of these missions began to crack the iron discipline of the regiment. We often talk about the bravery, but we rarely talk about the trauma. These were young women. They were seeing things that no human should see. There is a story of a navigator who, after a mission, refused to leave her plane. The mechanics tried to help her out, but she was gripping the gun mount so hard her fingers were locked. They had to pry her hands open. When they got her out, they realized she was not wounded. She had just frozen. Her mind had snapped under the terror of the searchlights. She was sent to the rear, shaking uncontrollably. Another pilot, returning from a mission where her wingman was incinerated, landed her plane perfectly. She taxied to the revetment, turned off the engine, and then simply could not move her legs. The adrenaline had masked the fact that she'd been shot through the thigh. She had flown for 40 minutes, bleeding out, powered only by the refusal to crash the plane. And the mechanics suffered too. One night, a bomb rack malfunctioned. A 100-kilogram bomb hung up. It did not drop. The pilot landed with the live bomb dangling by a single lug. As the plane bounced on the rough runway, the bomb swung wildly. If it fell, the plane and everyone near it would be vaporized. A mechanic, a 19-year-old girl named Galina, saw the danger. She did not run away. She ran toward the taxiing plane. She jumped onto the lower wing while the plane was still moving. She crawled out to the bomb rack, grabbed the 200-pound bomb with her arms, and held it steady against the wing until the pilot could stop. She risked being blown into pink mist to save the pilot. These stories cemented the bond between the women. They were not just a military unit. They were a family. They called each other by nicknames. They embroidered flowers on their flight suits. They danced to gramophone records in the dugouts, while German artillery pounded the earth above them. They fought to keep a shred of humanity in a world that had gone mad. but the war was changing again. The Po-2 was getting an upgrade, but not the kind you'd expect. As the Red Army pushed into Poland and Germany, the airspace became crowded. The Po-2s were sharing the sky with thousands of other aircraft. The danger of mid-air collisions was higher than the danger of flak. And the Germans were getting desperate. They were introducing new night fighters. The Heinkel HE-219 Uhu Owl. This was a dedicated hunter-killer, equipped with advanced radar and upward-firing cannons called Schrägemusik. These guns allowed the German fighter to fly under a bomber and shoot straight up into its belly, where there were no gunners. Against a heavy bomber, this was deadly. Against a Po-2, it was overkill. One night in 1944, a flight of night witches encountered a Uhu. The German pilot saw the biplanes on his radar. He closed in for the kill. He expected them to fly straight and level like the heavy bombers. Instead, the witches scattered. They used the starburst maneuver. Every plane broke in a different direction. One dove, one climbed, one turned left, one turned right. The German pilot, flying at 300 miles per hour, could not pick a target. He tried to turn with one of them, but the Po-2 turned inside him. The biplane could turn on a dime. The heavy German fighter overshot. Then, the witch turned hunter. The Po-2 navigator was armed with a single 7.62mm machine gun in the rear cockpit. It was a pea shooter. But as the German fighter zoomed past, exposing its belly, the navigator opened fire. She raked the underside of the high-tech fighter. She probably did not penetrate the armor, but she hit something. Maybe a coolant line. Maybe a hydraulic hose. The German fighter started to smoke. It broke off the attack and fled. Think about that. A biplane, designed in 1928, had just fended off a radar-equipped night fighter from 1944. It was like a grandmother fighting off a SWAT team with a rolling pin. But the most bizarre chapter of the Night Witch's history was about to be written. As they crossed the border into Germany, they found themselves flying over the very heart of the Nazi beast. And the Germans, knowing the end was near, unleashed a psychological weapon of their own. They started using the radio. The Po-2s eventually got radios late in the war. The German intelligence officers knew the frequencies. They would break into the channel. A voice, speaking perfect Russian, would come over the headset. "Hello, ladies. We know you are there. We have a warm reception waiting for you. Why do not you turn back? Go home to your mothers. You are going to die tonight." It was a ghost voice in the dark. It was designed to terrify them, to make them doubt. But the witches had an answer. One pilot, hearing the taunts, keyed her mic. She did not scream. She did not cry. She started singing. She sang a Russian folk song, Katyusha. Soon, another pilot joined in, then another. The entire squadron, flying through the dark over hostile territory, began to sing over the radio. They drowned out the Nazi threats with a chorus of voices. They turned the radio frequency into a choir. Down on the ground, the German radio operators must have been chilled to the bone. They were not listening to soldiers. They were listening to women singing as they flew to destroy them. It was a signal that the psychological war was lost. The Untermensch were not afraid. As 1945 dawned, the 46th Guards Regiment was poised for the final strike. Berlin was on the horizon. The city that Hitler promised would never be bombed was about to feel the wrath of the crop dusters. But the final battles would claim some of the best and brightest. The injections of courage were about to run into the solid wall of the Berlin Flak Tower defenses. And the cost of victory would be paid in wood and blood. By January 1945, the 46th Guards Regiment had flown over 20,000 sorties. They had dropped 3,000 tons of bombs. They had been flying non-stop for 3 years. The teenage girls who had arrived in Engels with braids and oversized boots were now hardened veterans with gray hairs and 1,000-yard stares. They crossed the border into Germany. The landscape changed. They were not flying over the snow-covered forests of Mother Russia anymore. They were flying over the industrial apocalypse of the Third Reich. Below them lay a sprawling web of factories, rail yards, and cities that were preparing to fight to the last man. The psychological dynamic flipped. For 3 years, the Germans had been the invaders. Now, the Germans were the victims, and the Night Witches were the angels of vengeance. The Luftwaffe was shattered, but the German ground defenses were thicker than ever. As the Reich shrank, the anti-aircraft guns became more concentrated. Every retreat meant that the guns were pulled back closer together. By the time the Russians reached the Oder River, the last natural barrier before Berlin, the flak was so dense it looked like a solid carpet of fire. The mission at the Oder River was not about bombing. It was about ghosts. Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet commander, needed to get his tanks across the river. The Germans had the bridges zeroed in. Every time a pontoon bridge was built, the German artillery destroyed it. Zhukov needed cover. He called the witches. They loaded the Po-2s with something different. Not high explosives, not bread, smoke canisters. Flying a smokescreen mission is suicidal. To lay an effective screen, you cannot fly high. You have to fly at 20 feet, directly between the enemy guns and your own troops. You have to fly in a straight line, steady and slow, while dragging a trail of chemical fog behind you. The witches flew these missions night after night. They became crop dusters of war, spraying a wall of white smoke that blinded the German gunners. Behind that wall, the Soviet T-34 tanks roared across the pontoons. The Germans could hear the tanks, but they could not see them. They fired blindly into the smoke, while the wooden biplanes buzzed overhead like angry hornets, mocking the master race's optics. Then came the push for Berlin. Berlin, in April 1945, was the most heavily defended city on Earth. It was a fortress. But it was not just defended by standard guns. It was defended by the Flaktürme, the flak towers. These were concrete monsters. Massive, castle-like bunkers rising hundreds of feet into the air. They had walls 8 feet thick. On top of these towers sat twin-mounted 128mm anti-aircraft cannons, capable of firing shells into the stratosphere. Lower down, they bristled with 37mm and 20mm quad cannons. These towers were designed to survive massive air raids by hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses. They were designed to fight the technological might of the Western Allies. They were absolutely not designed to fight a biplane. The Night Witches arrived over the suburbs of Berlin. They looked down at these concrete mountains. The sheer scale of the mismatch was comical. A Po-2 weighs less than a single shell fired by the main guns of a flak tower. But the witches found a weakness. The flak towers relied on radar and optical directors to track fast-moving targets. The Po-2 was, once again, too slow, too small, and too low. The pilots flew between the buildings. They used the ruins of Berlin as cover. They would pop up over a shattered apartment block, glide silently toward a flak tower, and drop a 50-kilogram bomb right onto the searchlight platforms. It was like a mosquito biting an elephant in the eye. The bomb would not destroy the tower, nothing could, but it would shatter the lights. It would kill the exposed crews. It would force the gunners to take cover. For a few minutes, the giant was blinded. And in those few minutes, the heavy Soviet artillery could open up without being spotted. But as the end of the war drew near, the tragedy became sharper. There is a cruel math in war. The last man to die is the unluckiest man on Earth. On a night in late April, just weeks before the surrender, a crew took off for a mission over the Silo Heights. The pilot was confident. The end was in sight. They could practically smell the victory. They never came back. They were not shot down by a fighter. They were not hit by a missile. They were hit by a single lucky shell from a ground soldier. The plane caught fire. They were too low to jump. The regiment watched from the airfield as the burning cross fell into the dark German forest. The grief was different now. In 1942, death was a daily expectation. In 1945, it felt like a theft. To survive Stalingrad, to survive the Crimea, to survive the hunger and the cold, only to burn to death 10 miles from Berlin, it was heartbreaking. But the survivors kept flying. They flew until they ran out of targets. On May 2nd, 1945, Berlin fell. The guns went silent. The smoke cleared. The Night Witches landed their battered, patched-up biplanes at an airfield just outside the city. They climbed out of their cockpits. They were not wearing dress uniforms. They were wearing oily flight suits, men's boots, and leather helmets. They looked like mechanics. They looked like exhausted factory workers. But they did something that the men in the shiny yak fighters did not do. They went to the Reichstag. The ruins of the German parliament building were covered in graffiti. Soviet soldiers from all over the Union had carved their names into the stone columns. Ivan from Omsk was here, for Stalingrad. The women of the 46th Guards Regiment found a spot. They took a piece of charcoal or red paint, and they wrote, "The Night Witches were here." It was a final act of defiance. The women who were told they belonged in the kitchen had flown all the way to the capital of fascism and left their mark on its tombstone. However, the end of the war brought a new, bitter reality: the parade. Stalin ordered a massive victory parade in Moscow. The Parade of Victors. Every regiment that had distinguished itself was invited to march across Red Square. The tanks, the artillery, the elite infantry. The 46th Guards Regiment was a hero regiment. They had 23 heroes of the Soviet Union in their ranks, more than almost any other unit. They had flown 30,000 missions. They had dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. By rights, they should have been leading the parade. But when the orders came down, the Night Witches were excluded. The reason? It was not combat performance. It was not lack of heroism. It was the plane. The organizers of the parade decided that the Po-2 was too slow to fly over Red Square. It would disrupt the timing of the fast jets and fighters. And the women? The organizers decided they could not march because their marching drill was not up to standard. They looked too much like civilians. They did not look like the polished, stone-faced super soldiers the propaganda wanted to show the world. So, while the men marched and the crowds cheered, the women who had terrified the Luftwaffe sat on the sidelines. They were told to go home. The war was over. The experiment was finished. They were expected to return to their universities, get married, have children, and forget that they had once been the deadliest pilots on the Eastern Front. And for a long time, that's exactly what happened. The history books were written by men. The glory went to the fighter aces like Kozhedub and Pokrishkin. The Night Witches faded into obscurity. They did not brag. They did not write memoirs immediately. They just went back to work. Nadia Popova became a flight instructor. Evdokia Bershanskaya worked in a committee for women's rights. They lived quiet lives, but the bond remained. Every year, on May 2nd, the survivors would meet in Moscow. They would sit on a park bench near the Bolshoi Theater. They would wear their medals, so many medals that their jackets were heavy. They would drink vodka, and they would sing. They did not sing patriotic anthems. They sang the songs of the regiment. Songs about the sewing machine engine. Songs about the girls who burned. Songs about the wind in the wires. Passers-by would look at these old grandmothers knitting on a bench and have no idea that they were looking at the women who had made the Nazis believe in witchcraft. One of the most powerful post-war stories involves a German veteran. Decades after the war, a former Luftwaffe pilot attended a reunion. He met one of the Night Witches. He looked at this small, gray-haired woman, and he started to cry. He told her, "You destroyed my nerves. I still wake up screaming because of that sound. The whoosh. The silence. I respected you more than any other enemy, because we knew you had no armor, and yet you came back every single night." He asked her, "How did you do it? Were you not afraid?" She smiled the same smile she had worn in the cockpit in 1942. "Of course we were afraid," she said, "but our anger was hotter than our fear." The legacy of the Po-2 is unique in aviation history. It is the only biplane to be credited with a jet kill. Wait, what? A jet kill? Yes, this is the final, impossible statistic. It happened not in World War II, but later, during the Korean War, where the North Koreans used Po-2s. An American F-94 Starfire jet fighter, a machine equipped with radar and rockets, spotted a Po-2 flying low and slow. The jet pilot slowed down to intercept. He slowed down too much. He stalled. The jet fell out of the sky and crashed. The Po-2 kept flying. Technically, it was a maneuver kill, but it proved the point one last time. Speed is not everything. The Night Witches proved that warfare is not just about the machine. It's about the spirit inside the machine. They took the worst plane of the war and turned it into the most feared psychological weapon on the front. They took the prejudice of their own government and turned it into elite status. They were the unseen, the unheard, and for the Germans, shivering in their trenches, they were the nightmare that never ended. So, when you think of the great air forces of history, do not just think of the Red Tails or the RAF. Think of the 588th. Think of a teenager named Galena holding a 200-pound bomb on a wing with her bare hands. Think of a navigator leaning out of a cockpit in a blizzard to drop a sack of bread. Think of the witches who flew on broomsticks made of plywood. We rescue these stories to ensure that the silence of the Po-2 does not become the silence of history. We tell them because these women deserve more than a footnote. They deserve a monument. If this story of the Witches of the Night gave you chills, do me a favor, smash that like button. It helps us fight the algorithm that wants to bury these legends. But check your subscription to make sure you're locked in. And I want to know, drop your city and state in the comments. Where are the Patriots watching from? And here is a question for you. Would you have the guts to turn off your engine over enemy lines? Or would you keep the power on and pray for speed? Let me know below. I'll see you in the next one. Keep your eyes on the sky and listen for the wind. To understand the price of the legend, we have to travel back to the summer of 1943. The location is the Kuban, the Blue Line. This was a massive German defensive fortification stretching across the Taman Peninsula. It was a wall of steel, concrete, and artillery designed to stop the Red Army from pushing the Germans into the sea. The air war over the Kuban was one of the fiercest of World War II. It was described as an aerial meat grinder. And right in the middle of it were the Night Witches. But the Germans were tired of being bombed by sewing machines. They were tired of the sleepless nights. So, they changed their tactics. They stopped trying to shoot the Po-2s down with flak. They brought in a specialist. His name was Joseph Kochiak. He was a Luftwaffe ace, a killer with dozens of victories. He flew the Messerschmitt Bf-110, a heavy, twin-engine night fighter. But Kochiak was not hunting with his eyes. He was hunting with mathematics. On the night of July 31st, 1943, the 46th Regiment launched a standard raid. The targets were German supply columns moving behind the Blue Line. The pilots, including the famous Nadia Popova, took off into a humid, heavy darkness. Something was wrong. Usually, when the Po-2s approached the front, the sky would light up. Searchlights, tracers, flak explosions. It was a chaotic fireworks display. But on this night, the Blue Line was silent. The searchlights stayed dark. The anti-aircraft guns remained cold. The silence was a trap. The Germans had cleared the airspace. They had ordered the flak gunners to stand down. They were clearing the stage for Kochiak. High above, cruising silently, Kochiak watched his radar screen. He saw the slow-moving blips of the Soviet biplanes. They were flying in a loose stream, one after another, like a conveyor belt of bombers. To Kochiok, they were not soldiers. They were targets on a shooting range. He dove. The first victim was the crew of Vysotskaya and Dokutovich. They never saw him. Kochiok came in from below and behind. He fired a short burst from his 20mm cannons. The shells smashed into the fragile wooden fuselage. The fuel tank exploded. From the airfield below, the other Night Witches watched in horror. They saw a sudden, violent ball of orange fire erupt in the sky. It was not a flak hit. It was a kill. The burning plane fell slowly, like a torch, tumbling into the darkness. There were no parachutes seen. Before the shock could even register, it happened again. Kochiok looped around. He found the next plane in the line, Rogova and Sukharukova. Another burst, another explosion, another burning cross falling from the sky. Panic began to spread over the radio. Fighter! Fighter! But what could they do? They could not outrun him. They could not climb. They were trapped in the air with a predator who could see in the dark. Kochiok was methodical. He did not rush. He knew they could not escape. He shot down a third plane, Pashkova and Maslova. The ground crews, standing by the runway miles away, were weeping. They were counting the fireballs. 1, 2, 3. Nadia Popova was in the air that night. She saw the planes burning. She saw her friends dying. She realized that the tactic that had saved them for 2 years, the silence, the slow speed, was useless against a hunter who knew exactly where to look. Kochiok shot down a fourth plane before he ran low on fuel or ammunition. 4 aircraft, 8 women, gone in the span of 20 minutes. It was a massacre. When the survivors landed, the airfield was silent. There was no singing that night, no dancing to the gramophone. They walked to the empty cots in the barracks. They looked at the neatly folded clothes of the women who would not be coming back. The next morning, they found the wreckage. It was a gruesome sight. The Po-2s had burned completely. The bodies were charred beyond recognition. The regiment buried them in a mass grave. They stood over the fresh earth, and they made a promise. They would not stop. They would not let the fear of the night fighter ground them, but they had to adapt. The Blue Line Massacre changed the doctrine of the Night Witches forever. They realized that flying singly was suicide against night fighters. So they increased the complexity of their tactics. They stopped flying in predictable streams. They started flying in waves with varied altitudes. They would send one plane in at 500 meters to draw the fighter's attention. While the fighter chased the decoy, 2 other planes would fly at 50 meters, hugging the ground, invisible against the dark earth. It was a shell game, and they weaponized the stall trap even further. If a pilot spotted a German fighter on her tail, usually by seeing the exhaust flames, she would pull the stick back violently into her stomach. The Po-2 would pitch up, hanging in the air at 40 miles per hour. The German fighter, flying at 250 miles per hour, would zoom past underneath. As he passed, the Po-2 pilot would kick the rudder, snap the plane over into a dive, and vanish into a ravine or behind a forest line. It was a maneuver that required nerves of steel. You were essentially presenting your belly to the enemy gunner and betting your life that his closure rate was too high for him to pull the trigger in time. But the psychological toll of the Cuban battles was not just about fear. It was about exhaustion. The human body is not designed to operate at night, under fire, for months on end. The women began to suffer from a unique condition known as navigator's blindness. They would stare into the darkness for so long, straining to see landmarks, that their eyes would simply stop focusing. They would go temporarily blind. They suffered from cockpit hallucinations. Pilots reported seeing non-existent mountains or phantom aircraft flying alongside them. They would land the plane, shaking, swearing that they had dodged a collision, only to be told the sky was empty. And yet, amidst this horror, they maintained a culture that was uniquely feminine and defiantly human. In the male regiments, the barracks were often grim places. In the 588th, the women transformed their dugouts. They picked wildflowers and put them in artillery shell casings. They embroidered patterns onto their foot wraps. They wrote poetry. One of the most famous figures in the regiment was Yevgenia Rudneva, the head navigator. She was an astronomy student from Moscow State University before the war. She was brilliant, soft-spoken, and dreamed of discovering new stars. In the middle of the war, between bombing missions, she would give lectures to the other women about the constellations. She would point up at the sky, the same sky that was trying to kill them, and teach them the names of the stars they used for navigation. She reminded them that the sky was not just a battlefield, it was a universe. Rudneva flew 645 missions. She died over Kerch in 1944. Her plane was caught in a searchlight beam and shot down by Flak. She burned like a meteor. But her legacy was not just the bombs she dropped. It was the humanity she kept alive in the trenches. This duality, the killer and the astronomer, the warrior and the student, is what terrified the Germans the most. It's easy to fight a monster. It's terrifying to fight a young woman who discusses heavy literature before climbing into a plywood plane to blow up your depot. The German ace Kochiak, the man who slaughtered them that night in the Kuban, his story ended fittingly. A few months later, he collided with another plane, or hit the ground, reports vary, and died. The witches outlived their executioner. As the regiment moved out of the Kuban and toward the Crimea, they carried the memory of that night like a scar. It hardened them. They were not just little sisters anymore. They were the survivors of the Blue Line. And they carried something else, too. A pencil. Why a pencil? Because in the open cockpit of a Po-2, ink freezes. You can't not use a pen. Navigators had to do complex trigonometry calculations to determine wind drift and drop points using only a pencil and a map, illuminated by a tiny flashlight with a red lens, while the plane bounced in turbulence and flak exploded around them. If they dropped the pencil, they were lost. They could not navigate. So they tied the pencils to their wrists with string. That piece of string was the lifeline of the entire mission. This attention to detail, the string, the pencils, the foot wraps, the timing, was the true superpower of the Night Witches. The Germans had better technology. They had radar. They had autopilots. The women had string and discipline. And in the end, the string won. This block is crucial because it bridges the gap between the ragtag volunteers of 1941 and the elite guards of 1945. It shows that they did not just get lucky. They paid a butcher's bill to learn how to survive. It honors the tragedy of the four planes, ensuring that the Night Witches label is not just a cool nickname, but a title earned in fire. If you look at the statistics of World War II aviation, the numbers usually follow a pattern. A typical American bomber crew in the B-17s flew 25 missions before they were sent home, if they survived. A fighter ace might fly 100 or 200 combat sorties over the course of the entire war. The legendary German ace Erich Hartmann flew 1,400 missions, but that was an anomaly, a statistical freak event. But in the 46th Guards Regiment, 500 missions was considered just getting started. There was a pilot named Irina Sabrova. She was a quiet woman, a former factory worker with intense eyes. She did not look like a super soldier. But by May 1945, Sabrova had climbed into her Po-2, taken off, flown into enemy fire, and landed 1,008 times. Let that number sink in. 1,008 combat sorties. That is not just a job. That is a life lived entirely in the air. It means that for 3 years, she flew essentially every single night that the weather allowed. It means she took off, risking death 3 or 4 times a night, every night, for 1,000 nights. The American military doctors would have grounded her after Mission 50 for combat fatigue. The Soviet doctors just gave her more tea and told her to get back in the plane. The physical toll of this endurance was horrific. We often picture pilots as dashing figures in leather jackets. The Night Witches, by the end of the war, looked like ghosts. They suffered from a condition they called bomb drunk. It was a chronic, deep exhaustion that went beyond sleepiness. Their hands shook constantly. They could not eat. They lost their menstrual cycles because their bodies were under so much stress that their biology simply shut down non-essential functions. When they landed after a sortie, they would not walk to the dugout. They would simply slump forward in the cockpit, resting their heads on the instrument panel, and fall into a micro-sleep for the 7 minutes it took the mechanics to reload the bombs. The mechanics would have to shake them awake. "Wake up, Ira! The bombs are loaded!" Sabrova would lift her head, eyes red-rimmed, start the engine, and go back into the flak. Why? Why did not they collapse? Because they knew the math. The Po-2 carried a tiny payload, maybe 200 kilograms. To equal the destruction of one heavy bomber raid, they had to fly hundreds of sorties. They felt a crushing personal responsibility. If I do not fly this 5th mission tonight, a pilot would think, then that German artillery battery keeps firing, and 100 Russian infantrymen die at dawn. They were trading their sleep for soldiers' lives. This relentless tempo led to some of the most bizarre near misses of the war. There is the story of a pilot who returned from a mission over Poland. She landed, climbed out, and felt something heavy in her flight helmet. She took it off. A 20mm German shell fragment had pierced the leather, traveled around the inside curve of the helmet, right next to her skull, and lodged in the padding by her ear. If it had been an inch to the left, she would have been dead. She stared at the metal shard, put the helmet back on, and went to the briefing. There was another navigator, Raisa Aronova, who was reading her map during a mission. A German bullet punched through the bottom of the fuselage, went through the map case, shattered her pencil, and exited through the canopy. She was left holding 2 halves of a map. She did not get a scratch. She later joked, "The Germans are criticizing my navigation." But the luck was not infinite. The law of averages is cruel. One of the most heartbreaking losses occurred right at the finish line. We mentioned the tragedy of the last man to die, but for the Night Witches, it was personal. Dusia Nosal was a hero of the Soviet Union. She was one of the best. She had flown hundreds of missions. She was pregnant. Wait, pregnant? Yes. Amidst the horror of the war, life happened. Romances bloomed between the Night Witches and the male pilots of neighboring fighter regiments. It was strictly forbidden, of course, but love finds a way in the trenches. Dusia had fallen in love, gotten married in a rushed field ceremony, and conceived a child. By regulations, she should have been grounded immediately, but she hid it. She wore her greatcoat loose. She kept flying. She did not want to leave her sisters. On a mission in 1943, a German fighter caught her. A cannon shell hit the cockpit. Dusia was killed instantly. The plane crashed. The regiment did not just lose a hero, they lost a future. The grief in the barracks that night was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was a reminder that they were not just fighting machines. They were women who wanted to live, to be mothers, to have a future that did not involve high explosives. This human element is what makes the story so powerful. They were not robots. They were terrified. There is a diary entry from a pilot named Zhenya. She writes about the fear of fire. "I am not afraid of dying," she wrote. "I am afraid of burning. I am afraid of losing my face. If I am hit, I pray it is quick. I do not want to be ugly." It's a shockingly vulnerable admission. In the middle of a brutal war, a young woman is worried about her face. It reminds us that they were 20 years old. They had vanity. They had dreams. They were not just the motherland's warriors. They were girls who missed wearing dresses and going to dances. And yet, they weaponized this femininity. When the Red Army captured German airfields, the witches would often land to inspect the enemy planes. There is a famous account of a group of night witches standing next to a captured Messerschmitt Bf 109. They looked at the sleek metal fighter, the heavy armor, the thick glass. One of the mechanics, a girl who stood 5 feet tall, kicked the tire of the German plane. "Look at this," she said. "It has a heater. It has a radio. It has armor. And we still beat them." It was the ultimate mic drop. They took pride in their poverty. They wore their lack of equipment like a badge of honor. "You needed all this technology to fight us," they seemed to say, "and we beat you with wood and canvas." But as the war ended, the adrenaline that had sustained them for 1,000 nights began to fade. And when the adrenaline leaves, the pain arrives. In May 1945, after the surrender, the regiment was stationed near Berlin. The guns were silent. For the first time in 3 years, they could sleep through the night. But they could not sleep. The silence was too loud. They woke up screaming. They reached for bomb release levers that were not there. The psychological trauma, what we now call PTSD, hit them like a tidal wave. They had suppressed the fear for so long that when they finally let it in, it broke them. Some of them fell into deep depressions. Some became alcoholics. Most just became incredibly, profoundly quiet. They had aged 20 years in 3. They looked in the mirror and saw strangers with lined faces and gray hair. They were 23 years old, but they felt like old women. And then came the final insult: the disbandment. In October 1945, the 46th Guards Regiment was officially dissolved. The planes, the faithful, battered Po-2s that had carried them through hell, were not preserved. They were considered junk. Most were scrapped on the spot. The women were given demobilization papers and a train ticket home. There was no transition program, no counseling. They went from being the most feared pilots in the world to being students and factory workers again, overnight. When they returned to Moscow, or Leningrad, they found a society that did not quite know what to do with them. The Soviet Union celebrated the collective victory, but the traditional gender roles snapped back into place with a vengeance. The narrative became, the men fought, the women helped. A woman who had commanded a squadron of bombers found herself being told to fetch coffee in an office. A mechanic who could repair an aircraft engine in a blizzard was told she was not qualified to fix a car. They learned to hide their medals. They learned to stop talking about the war, because when they did talk, people did not believe them. "You flew bombers?" a man would ask at a dinner party. "No, you must have been a radio operator or a nurse. Women did not fly bombers." It was gaslighting on a national scale. Their history was being rewritten in real time to fit the comfortable narrative of male heroism. So the Night Witches went underground. They formed a secret society of sorts. They kept in touch. They wrote letters. And every year, on Victory Day, they would meet. They would gather in a park in Moscow. They would wear their old, ill-fitting flight jackets. And for one day a year, they were the queens of the sky again. They would toast to the girls. They would toast to Dusia and Luba and all the ones who burned. They kept the flame alive not for the government, not for the history books, but for each other. It was not until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the full archives were opened and the West truly learned the scale of what they had done. Western historians were shocked. 30,000 sorties? All female crews? It sounded like fiction, but the numbers do not lie. The craters they left in Germany do not lie, and the nightmares of the German veterans did not lie. As we prepare for the final legacy block, we have to recognize that the story of the Night Witches is not just a war story. It is a story about the failure of underestimation. The Germans underestimated the Po-2 because it was slow. The Soviet government underestimated the women because of their gender. History underestimated them because they did not fit the mold of the hero. But Irina Sabrova, landing her plane for the 1008th time, did not care about estimation.
She shut down the engine, climbed out of the cockpit,
And asked for a cigarette. She had done the job, and she had done it better than anyone else.